Have you ever thought about what the world languages were 1,000 years ago? What influenced language expansion? How they used language or how much advanced the language was? What the world will speak in 2115? So welcome back to Language Shapes Perception. If you're new here and you like our content, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. A century from now, it's expected to have fewer but simpler languages on every continent. In 1880, a Bavarian priest created a language that he hoped the whole world could use. He mixed words from French, German, and English and gave his creation the name Volapük, which didn't do it any favors. Worse, Volapük was hard to use, sprinkled with some odd sounds and case endings like Latin. It made a splash for a few years but was soon pushed aside by another invented language, Esperanto, which had a lyrical name and was much easier to master. A game learner could pick up its rules of usage in an afternoon. But it didn't matter. By the time Esperanto got out of the gate, another language was already emerging as an international medium, English. 2,000 years ago, English was the unwritten tongue of Iron Age tribes in Denmark. 1,000 years after that, it was living in the shadow of French-speaking overlords on a dampish little island. No one then living could have dreamt that English would be spoken today, to some degree, by almost 2 billion people, on its way to being spoken by every third person on the planet. Science fiction often presents us with whole planets that speak a single language. But that fantasy seems more menacing here in real life on this planet we call home. That is, in a world where some worry that English might eradicate every other language. The humans can express themselves in several thousand languages is a delight in countless ways. Few would welcome the loss of this variety. But the existence of so many languages can also create problems. It isn't an accident that the Bible's tale of the Tower of Babel presents multilingualism as a divine curse meant to hinder our understanding. One might even ask, if all humans had always spoken a single language, would anyone wish we were instead separated now by thousands of different ones? Thankfully, fears that English will become the world's only language are premature. Few are so pessimistic as to suppose that there will not continue to be a multiplicity of nations and cultures on our planet and, along with them, various languages beside English. It is difficult, after all, to interpret something as intimate and spontaneous as what language people speak to their children. Who truly imagines a Japan with no Japanese or a Greece with no Greek? The spread of English just means that Earthlings will tend to use a local language in their own orbit and English for communication beyond. But the days when English shared the planet with thousands of other languages are numbered. A traveler to the future, a century from now, is likely to notice two things about the language landscape of Earth. 1. There will be vastly fewer languages. 2. Languages will often be less complicated than they are today, especially in how they are spoken as opposed to how they are written. Some may protest that it is not English but Mandarin Chinese that will eventually become the world's language, because of the size of the Chinese population and the increasing economic might of their nation. But that's unlikely. For one, English happens to have gotten there first. It is now so deeply entrenched in print, education, and media that switching to anything else would entail an enormous effort. We retain the QWERTY keyboard and AC current for similar reasons. Also, the tones of Chinese are extremely difficult to learn beyond childhood, and truly mastering the writing system virtually requires having been born to it. In the past, of course, notoriously challenging languages such as Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Arabic, Russian, and even Chinese have been embraced by vast numbers of people. But now that English has settled in, its approachability as compared with Chinese will discourage its replacement. Many a world power has ruled without spreading its language, and just as the Mongols and Manchus once ruled China while leaving Chinese intact, if the Chinese ruled the world, they will likely do so in English. Some have predicted that Mandarin Chinese will eventually become the world's language, but its elaborate tones are too difficult to learn beyond childhood. Yet more to the point, by 2115, it's possible that only about 600 languages will be left on the planet as opposed to today's 6,000. Japanese will be fine, but languages spoken by smaller groups will have a hard time of it. Too often, colonialization has led to the disappearance of languages. Native speakers have been exterminated or punished for using their languages. This has rendered extinct or moribund most of the languages of Native Americans in North America and Aboriginal people of Australia. Urbanization has only furthered the destruction. By bringing people away from their homelands to cities where a single lingua franca reigns, even literacy, despite its benefits, can threaten linguistic diversity. To the modern mind, languages used in writing, with its permanence and formality, seem legitimate and real, while those that are only spoken, that is, all but a couple of hundred of them today, can seem evanescent and parochial. Few illusions are harder to shed than the idea that only writing makes something a language. Consider the Yiddish is often described as a dying language, at a time when hundreds of thousands of people are living and raising children in it, just not writing it much, every day in the US and Israel. It is easy for speakers to associate larger languages with opportunity and smaller ones with backwardness, and therefore to stop speaking smaller ones to their children. But unless a language is written, once a single generation no longer passes it on to children whose minds are maximally plastic, it is all but lost. We all know how much harder it is to learn a language well as adults. In a community where only older people now speak a language fluently, the task is vastly more difficult than just passing on some expressions, words and word endings. The Navajo language made news recently when a politician named Chris Dechen was barred from leading the Navajo Nation because his Navajo isn't fluent. One wishes Mr. Dechen well in improving his Navajo, but he has a mountain to climb. In Navajo, there is no such thing as a regular verb. You have to learn by heart each variation of every verb. Plus, it has tones. That's what indigenous languages tend to be like in one way or another. Languages grow in complexity the way that people pick up habits and cars pick up rust. 1 minute the way you mark a verb in the future tense is to use will, I will buy it. An idiom kicks in where people say, I'm gonna go buy it, or I'm going to buy it. Because if you're going with the purpose of doing something, it follows that you will. Pretty soon that gels into a new way of putting a verb in the future tense with what a Martian would hear as a new word, gonna. In any languages, that kind of thing is happening all the time in countless ways, far past what is necessary even for nuanced communication. The distinction between he and she is a frill that most languages do without, and English would be fine without gonna alongside will. A language isn't something that can be trimmed like a bush, and children have no trouble picking up even the weirdest of linguistic frills. A click language of Southern Africa typically has not just 2 or 3 but as many as dozens of different clicks to master. Native speakers have a bump on their larynx from producing them 24/7. For English speakers, it seems hard enough that Mandarin Chinese requires you to distinguish 4 tones to get across meaning. But in the Hmong languages of Southeast Asia, any syllable means different things according to as many as 8 tones. But the very things that make these languages so fabulously rich and also makes it hard to revive them once lost, it's tough to learn, hard stuff when you're grown, busy and self-conscious. There are diligent efforts to keep various endangered languages from dying, but the sad fact is that few are likely to lead communities raising children in the language, which is the only way a language exists as its full self. Instead, many communities, passing their ancestral language along by teaching it in school and to adults, will create new versions of the languages, with smaller vocabularies and more streamlined grammars. The Irish Gaelic, proudly spoken by today's English Gaelic bilinguals, is an example of something one might call a new Gaelic. New versions of languages like this will be part of a larger trend, growing over the past few millennia. In particular, the birth of language is less baroquely complicated than the linguistic norm of the pre-modern world. The first wave in the development occurred when technology began to allow massive, abrupt population transfers. Once large numbers of people could cross an ocean at one time or be imported by force into a territory, a new language could end up being learned by hordes of adults instead of by children. As we know from our experience in the classroom, adults aren't as good at mastering the details of a language as toddlers are, and the result was simpler languages. Vikings, for example, invaded England starting in the 8th century and married into the society. Children in England, hearing their fathers' broken Old English in a time when schooling was limited to elites and there was no media, grew up speaking that kind of English. Mandarin, Persian, Indonesian, and other languages went through similar processes and are therefore much less cluttered than a normal language is. Now, these languages can express any nuance of human thought, but they haven't existed long enough to also dangle unnecessary things like willfully irregular verbs. These are called Creole languages. It's far easier to manage a basic conversation in a Creole than in any older language. Haitian Creole, for example, is a language low on the complications that make learning Navajo or Hmong so tough. It spares a student from having to know that boats are male and tablets are female, which is one of the reasons that it's so hard to master French, the language from which it got most of its word. Creole languages were created worldwide during the era that the textbooks call Western exploration. African soldiers created an Arabic Creole in Sudan. Orphans created a German one in New Guinea. Aboriginal Australians created an English Creole, which was passed on to surrounding locations such as, again, New Guinea, where under the name Tok Pisin, it is today the language of government for people speaking hundreds of different native languages. Jamaican Patois, South Carolina's Gula, and Cape Verdon are other examples. Modern population movements are now creating a third wave of language streamlining. In cities worldwide, children of immigrants speaking many different languages are growing up speaking among themselves a version of their new country's language. It's a kind of compromise between the original version of the language and the way their parents speak it. Linguists have no single term yet for these new speech varieties, but from Kiesdeutsch in Germany to Kebabnorsk in Norway, from the urban Wolof of Senegal to Singapore's Singlish, the world is witnessing the birth of slightly optimized versions of old languages. This streamlining should not be taken as a sign of decline. All of the optimized languages remain full languages in every sense of the term, as we know from the fact that I'm writing in one. An old English speaker who heard modern English would consider it confounding and broken. That any language has all irregular verbs, 8 tones, or female tables is ultimately a matter of accident, not design. Hopefully, the languages lost amid all of this change will at least be described and, with modern tools, recorded for posterity. We may regret the eclipse of a world where 6,000 different languages were spoken as opposed to just 600, but there is a silver lining in the fact that ever more people will be able to communicate in one language that they use alongside their native one. After all, what's peculiar about the Babel tale is the idea of linguistic diversity as a curse, not the idea of universal comprehension as a blessing. The future promises both a goodly amount of this diversity and ever more mutual comprehension as many languages become easier to pick up in their spoken versions that they once were. A future dominated by English won't be a linguistic paradise, but it won't be a linguistic Armageddon either. Studying language is a privilege. When you analyze language in everyday speech, you realize that there is an astonishing amount of wonder in the system that we take for granted. Linguists question the obvious, which is language, and got answers that forever change mankind's understanding of language and human nature. We all speak one language. One of the main discoveries of modern linguistics is that it made us aware that all the languages we speak are similar in astonishing respects. They manifest the same pattern, follow the same rules, they are learned in the exactly same way, and that all the differences are only superficial. So in a sense, we all speak the same language. This was captured by Chomsky in an excellent metaphor titled Language and Mind, in which he says that if a Martian scientist, somebody with a different kind of intelligence, were to study the world's languages, he would conclude that they are all dialects of a single language embodying a universal grammar, reflecting a hardwired, genetically determined linguistic module inherent in the human brain. Studies of topologically different languages show that this is indeed the case. I will mention in passing one of probably the main arguments used to prove this. Take a child that was born in China and have him raised in Saudi Arabia and he'll grow up speaking Arabic. What does that say to you? It says that a human child is hardwired to learn any languages and that all human languages, say Mandarin and Arabic in this case, are fundamentally the same. If they weren't, the task of child to learn any language would be impossible. This has massive implications, the greatest of which is that all the 7,000 human languages have the same source and that every language spoken today evolved from the same great-great-great-grandmother tongue. Another implication is that if a Martian would fly past our planet, he would hear Japanese and Ojibwe like we hear British and American English. This is an interesting line of thought. If you want to read more about it, I got a good book you could read. It's called Chomsky's Universal Grammar, an Introduction. Part 2. Language change is natural. People so often combat language change and are feared by it. Linguists know that natural language change is not bad for a language. Adopting loan words from other languages, losing inflection, cases, genders, articles, and formally distinct sounds, this happens in all languages and is nothing to worry about. For a linguist, it's an interesting phenomenon worth analyzing. For some people, it's proof for the demise of language, the end of civilized culture and the beginning of the dying of the proper language. But languages constantly change, and this is certainly not how languages die. Too many people fear language change. Many people think that if we don't attempt to regulate the correct form of speaking, from spelling to pronunciation to word choice, then we will all plunge into anarchy or some sort of misfortune. It's a sham. Language constantly evolves, and even those political or cultural elites who claim to use it correctly fail to do so themselves. And even those who fancy themselves as guardians of the correct way of speaking can't even agree on whether split infinitives are kosher. Societies arise and fall, but not because too many people started to say ain't when they should have said isn't. Part 3. There are no bad grammars. One of the things you know when you start studying languages is that you realize how stupid is the claim that says there are bad grammars. Linguists know that all dialects, even those considered bad grammar by many people, are as fully formed and rule-bound as any other language. Someone who uses Appalachian dialect or African American vernacular English, to use two United States examples, is not simply ignorant of grammatical rules taught in school or speaking sloppily. They are following a different set of rules, which are consistent within their own dialect. Sometimes the linguistic complexity of languages associated with underprivileged societies, and that we call bad grammars, far exceeds that of modern and privileged societies. William Labov, in fact, analyzed African American vernacular English and showed us that it is a beautiful language with a sophisticated structure and has many features that standard English lacks. You can read more about this Labov's own book titled Language in the Inner City, Studies in the Black English Vernacular. Part 4. There are monolingual linguists. I don't know how to stress this further. Being a linguist does not equal being a polyglot. While it's true that linguists study all languages, this does not mean that they engage in learning them. They only study them to test certain hypotheses related to how languages work. Linguists know that there are monolingual linguists. There are even linguists who advise against learning languages. Seriously, people should stop using linguist and polyglot or language lover synonymously. The surest way to annoy a linguist is to ask, so how many languages do you speak? Part 5. Language is fractal. Linguists know that you really can't fully describe any human language. It seems to be impossible to produce enough rules to fully describe any natural language. You always find that there are wild expressions that your rules forbid and invalid expressions that your rules permit. That's what we mean when we say all grammars leak. Of course, you can create new rules to cover those exceptions. But teams have spent decades at this without closing all the holes, despite creating tens of thousands of rules. This is one reason linguists have trouble taking grammar perspectivists seriously. We know that no description of grammar small enough to fit in a single volume can be anything more than a set of guidelines. Part 6. Monoglots can become polyglots. Linguists know that everybody who speaks one language can learn others if they want to. The mathematics behind linguistics, for example, automata theory and Chomsky's hierarchy of languages, indicate that an astonishing amount of intelligence is required to become a monoglot. The more we study computational linguistics, the automata theory, the more we understand this. The simplest theoretical machine that could accurately parse a human language and map to meanings would be incredibly complex. Surprisingly, the amount of complexity one must add in order to parse a second language is almost negligible. In other words, there is no real difference in the intelligence necessary to become a monoglot or a polyglot. Perceived differences in difficulty have more to do with learning as an adult versus as a child during the critical period, and with the enjoyment of learning and willingness to work. I'm sure linguists know so much more that can be said in the video. Linguists changed our perceptions about language, changed the way we regard minority languages, and most importantly, linguists made us aware that no language is inferior. Join the bandwagon to recognize the efforts of linguists by subscribing to this channel and sharing this video. Language is one of the fundamental dynamics in the composition of a culture. The power of a nation is directly proportional to the power and richness of its language and thought. A perfect command of language and the ability to engage easily in dialogue with others protect a person from outside influence. Language is an important tool for humankind in our efforts to better understand the cosmos and events both holistically and analytically. From every aspect, language plays a defining role in the formation of our culture. Language is not only a means of speech and thought. It is a bridge with the significant function of bringing the wealth of the past to our day and conveying today's heritage and our new compositions to the future. All of the cognitive, intellectual, and scientific reserves and riches of a nation can become eternal only by means of a language powerful enough to embrace this heritage as a whole. A heritage that has descended from the ancestors and taken new forms in the hands of today's generations. The more richly and colorfully a nation can speak, the more they can think. The more they can think, the broader is the span their speech can reach. Every single society leaves behind what they speak and think today for its validity to be probed, tested, and protected by future generations. In this way, a huge reserve of experience and learning are saved from being wasted. What was right or wrong in the past is compared with the rights and wrongs of today so that we do not tread the same path and suffer from the same errors. This is valid for all nations of the world. The capacity of a language to express a thought is related to the level of development it has achieved, and a thought can become the instrument by which the language is tuned to this level of development. If a language has not developed with its inner dynamics to voice the needs of all times, and therefore the users of that language cannot find the words corresponding to certain concepts, then that language is deprived of the support of thought, and its users are doomed to failure. In a time of industrialization, global commerce, and technological warehouses, no one should stay within the limited span of dictionaries in hand or what they hear and learn from the people around them. Otherwise, they will have to remain silent and merely listen to what others have to say. Such difference to the requirements of the modern age leads to disqualification from participation in contemporary societies. The earnings of yesterday should be conserved as a cultural heritage and utilized today. Historical and social dynamics are threads with which national ideas should be interlaced. By all means, this should be realized while opening up to tomorrow and embracing the modern age. As a matter of fact, yesterday has passed with all its frame of reference. What is more, reaching out to the future at full speed requires much more sustenance than we can draw from our homes, family, and immediate environment, though they may suffice for our practical daily needs. Failure is the inescapable end of the ill-fated and forlorn ones who are far from facing their era with their own language and thought. Just as important as ensuring language and thought survive is making them a property of the masses. Societies which do not think and speak will find others speak and think on their behalf. Logic is in disposal of the tongue in crowds where there is speech without thought. Those unfortunate ones who cannot put what they think into words are slaves of their incapability. Although not in great numbers, there are still self-confident thinkers who can elaborate their thoughts. Nevertheless, they too are not free from problems. In many countries, those who look like the elite from the outside are in truth alien to their own society. The majority in their society respond to this elite with an inner opposition for they do not trust them, and their thoughts are perceived as nothing more than mere fantasy and imported views. You find the prose of these intellectuals written in their own language but with the mindset of an alien, and when they have to speak they feel the need to switch to the vernacular of their fellow countrymen. Thus, they travel in between several worlds in their inner presence, in a state of multiple belongings to different realms at the same time. They cannot adjust their hearts to beat in tune with the heart of their society, nor can they reflect the pattern of eloquence and power of expression embedded in their language. It would be naive to expect some sort of valuable service from such people who are entrapped in contradictions within their personal world of thought. For a language truly to become the medium of communication, the overwhelming majority of a society must be able to express themselves in it with full command and reflecting its true nature. Expressions in a complicated way like loading the real intention to diverse allusions or signs and relaying every subject in the form of detailed interpretations are obviously not the most agreeable types of presentation. Language is a phenomenon the worth of which lies intrinsically in itself, like other sciences, and perhaps its importance is even of a greater magnitude. Thus, any society should conceive of its language as a field of knowledge, and the interest of the masses must be drawn to it as a pleasurable topic. This is possible only by way of a long list of tasks to do with language, a successful compilation of every single word, a careful study of manuscripts, a deep analysis of the methodology and stylistics of derivative forms in harmony with the peculiar nature of a language, to make widely known and used those words and idioms that have been in use over many centuries, firmly settled with all their nuances and with their specific meanings revealed best in that language. It is of a paramount importance for a nation to be respectful towards all these components of preserving a language. If all these can be achieved, then a language can stand on its own principles and rules, as rich, soft, and amiable as a language can be. A language can become the lingua franca of an age while maintaining its inherent logic. It will be in use delightfully and will be transferred from one generation to the next. Although this expectation does not seem theoretically or logically exaggerated, it is not easy to realize it. There will be challenges while putting it into practice. Something being logical might not always mean the same thing as the logic of its development, transformation, and maturation. The unfolding of events may follow a different path. In the case of constant change, the logic of development must be given priority above absolute logic. The reins controlling it must be loosed a little, and space for maneuver must be enlarged. If not, language and thought, both living phenomena, will become stagnant, as solidified as rock, and will lose their soul. Language has a determining influence on the national thought and worldview and their logical intellectual structure. Language has to be in its prime to go beyond historical value and respond positively to every favorable development. Nations that can manage to develop their language and make it accommodating, while at the same time staying faithful to the roots of it, are the most communicative societies that are also most dynamic in thought. The relationship between language and thought comprises cognitive and intellectual reflections on existence and events, transforming these reflections into sources of information and becoming productive while forming links between the cosmos and our knowledge. The future prospects of a nation are very much dependent on evaluating these relationships. We should not cast everything that is old into oblivion, nor turn our face to the past and close our doors to what is new. Let us embrace the past with the utmost sincerity and at the same time salute the coming days with their open, new developments and transformations. Let us not cause any conflict between language and thought, between our past that is filled with exalted memories and our future that we strive so hard for. Let us not sacrifice one for the other. The roots that make up the national spirit should be determined with the help of research. While relying firmly on those roots, a society should endeavor to go beyond them. Our hearts should beat connected to our essential dynamics of our spiritual heritage, and our eyes should be fixed beyond the horizon. We should aim to live and flourish with an insatiable thing for opening out. This is how it can be possible to make future generations survive. Those generations to whose sake we should bind our existence. It must be those selfless men and women who are devoted to making other lives and expect nothing in return, who cherish this life best with its all possible dimensions.